Hello, my fellow sleepers. Welcome back to another journey through time. Before we begin tonight's adventure, I want you to take a moment to dim those lights. Maybe light a candle if you have one nearby, and put on some gentle music that makes your soul feel at peace. Get comfortable in your bed, pull those covers up, and let your breathing slow down naturally. I'm curious, where are you tuning in from tonight? Are you listening from a cozy bedroom in London as the rain patters against your window? Perhaps you're in a small apartment in Tokyo, watching the city lights twinkle in the distance. Or maybe you're somewhere in between, in a place I've never been, but where someone just like you is seeking the same gentle escape into history that we all crave. What time is it where you are? Is it late evening, with the world settling into quiet around you? Or perhaps it's already deep into the night, and you're one of the few souls still awake, seeking stories to carry you into peaceful dreams. Wherever you are, whatever time it is, you're exactly where you need to be. Tonight, we're going to step into the worn leather boots of a merchant from long ago, a man who knew the Silk Road like the lines on his weathered hands. His name was Hassan ibn Muhammad, though he rarely used his full name in the remote places where he traded. To most, he was simply the merchant with the kind eyes and the sharp mind for business. Through his own words, written in a journal he kept during one of his most memorable journeys, we'll experience what it truly meant to risk everything for the promise of profit and adventure along the world's most dangerous trade route. So, close your eyes now and let yourself drift back nearly 800 years to a time when the world was both much larger and much smaller than it is today. My name is Hassan, and I have been walking these trade routes for more than 20 years now. The soles of my feet know the feeling of sand, stone, and mountain path better than they know the comfort of my own home. Today marks the beginning of what I suspect will be one of my most challenging journeys yet. I am setting out from Samarkand with a caravan of 37 camels, each one loaded with goods that represent not just my livelihood, but my life's work. The morning air is crisp here in Samarkand, carrying with it the scent of baking bread from the markets and the sound of merchants preparing for their own journeys. My camels shift restlessly, their bells creating a gentle music that has become the soundtrack of my existence. I run my hand along the neck of my lead camel, an old female I call Zahra. She has been with me for 8 years now, and I trust her instincts more than I trust most humans. In my cargo are rolls of Chinese silk, so fine they feel like captured moonlight between your fingers. Jars of precious spices from the islands far to the south, and small bags of gems that catch the early light like drops of captured fire. But the real treasure in my caravan is not any single item. It is the knowledge I carry, the understanding of which goods will sell where, which routes are safe this season, and which officials can be trusted with a caravan's safe passage. As we prepare to leave the familiar walls of Samarkand behind, I feel the old mixture of excitement and apprehension that always comes at the start of a long journey. The route ahead will take us through the Kizilkum Desert, a stretch of land so harsh that many merchants speak of it only in whispers. From there, if we survive, we will reach the oasis city of Kashgar, where I hope to trade my goods for others that will fetch good prices in the markets of Damascus or Baghdad. The other merchants in my caravan are a mix of seasoned traders like myself and younger men hungry for their first taste of real profit. There is Ahmed, who has been trading almost as long as I have, his beard now more white than black, and his eyes holding the same cautious wisdom that I see in my own reflection. Then there are the young ones like Farid, barely 20, who sees only the potential for wealth and not yet the countless ways this desert can claim a man's life.
The first 3 days out of Samarkand passed as they always do, with a rhythm that becomes as natural as breathing when you have done this journey many times before. We wake before dawn, when the air is still cool and the camels are rested. The process of loading and preparing takes nearly 2 hours, but this routine is sacred to us. A carelessly secured load or a missed inspection of a camel's feet can mean disaster hundreds of miles from help. Zara leads our small procession with the confidence of a creature who has walked these paths before. Behind her, the other camels follow in a line that stretches back like prayer beads on a string. Each animal carries roughly 400 pounds of goods, their loads carefully balanced and wrapped in leather and canvas to protect against the sand and sun that will soon become our constant companions. The landscape around us changes gradually as we move away from the green valleys near Samarkand. The grass becomes sparse and yellow, then gives way to scrub brush that looks like it is barely clinging to life. By the afternoon of our second day, we are walking through land that shows little sign of life beyond the occasional lizard scurrying across our path or a bird of prey circling high overhead, riding the thermals in search of something to hunt. I find myself falling into the meditative state that long desert journeys require. The mind cannot remain constantly alert to danger and discomfort, or it will break under the strain. Instead, I let my consciousness settle into a rhythm that matches the swaying gait of the camels and the soft sound of their feet in the sand. My eyes scan the horizon automatically, looking for the signs that experience has taught me to watch for. But my deeper thoughts drift to memories of other journeys, other successes and failures along these ancient routes. The heat builds gradually, and by midday we are all wrapped in cloth that leaves only our eyes exposed. The sun here is not just warm, it is aggressive, pressing down on us with an intensity that can kill the unprepared. I watch young Farid struggling with the heat, his movements already becoming sluggish and uncertain. At our next rest stop, I approach him with a water skin and some advice that might save his life. Drink small sips frequently, I tell him, noting how his lips are already cracking despite only 2 days in the desert. Your body is not yet used to preserving water. The desert will teach you, but you must listen to what it is saying. He nods gratefully, and I see in his eyes the first real understanding of what this journey will demand from him. This is good. Fear, when it is the right amount and directed properly, keeps a man alive in places like this. That evening, as we make camp in the shadow of some low hills, I write these words by the light of a small oil lamp. Around me, the other men are settling into their blankets, talking quietly among themselves, or checking their animals one final time before sleep. The desert night is coming alive with sounds that city dwellers never hear. The distant call of a night bird, the rustle of small creatures moving through the brush, and underneath it all, the vast silence that seems to stretch on forever. Tomorrow we will leave behind the last reliable water source for many days. From here we must trust in our supplies and our knowledge of where the next oasis lies. I have made this calculation many times before, but it never becomes routine. Too much can go wrong in the empty spaces between one source of water and the next.
On our fourth day, as the morning sun was beginning to assert its dominance over the landscape, we encountered another caravan coming from the opposite direction. In the desert, such meetings are both commonplace and significant. They represent opportunities to trade information that can mean the difference between life and death, as well as chances to conduct business or simply enjoy the company of fellow travelers in this vast emptiness. The approaching caravan was smaller than ours, perhaps 20 camels in total, but I could see from their formation and the condition of their animals that these were experienced desert traders. As we drew closer, I recognized the lead merchant as Ibn Battuta, a man I had done business with several times over the years. His weathered face broke into a smile when he saw me, and we both urged our camels forward to meet in the space between our two groups. "Hassan, my old friend," he called out as we approached, his voice carrying the particular tone of relief that comes from meeting a trusted person in an uncertain place. "Allah has blessed us with this meeting. How are the roads ahead?" We dismounted and embraced in the traditional way, while our respective caravans arranged themselves for a brief rest and the opportunity to trade news. This exchange of information is one of the most important aspects of Silk Road travel. The conditions ahead can change rapidly due to weather, bandits, political upheavals, or a dozen other factors. A merchant who travels without current information travels blind, and blind merchants do not usually survive long in the desert. "The route behind us has been peaceful," I told him, accepting the cup of tea that his servants had quickly prepared. "No sign of raiders, and the wells at Karakum are running clear and deep. What news do you bring from Kashgar?" Ibn Battuta's expression grew more serious as he sipped his tea. "The news from Kashgar is mixed, my friend. The markets are strong and goods are selling well, especially silk and spices from your part of the world. But there have been reports of increased bandit activity in the region we call the Devil's Gap, about 3 days' journey west of the city. A caravan was attacked there 2 weeks ago. They lost half their goods, though thankfully no lives were lost." This was troubling news, but not entirely unexpected. The area he described was known for its dangers, a narrow passage between high cliffs where caravans were forced to travel single file and had little room to maneuver if attacked. I had been through there many times before, but always with a mixture of caution and prayer. "Are they local bandits or the organized groups from the northern tribes?" I asked. The distinction was important. Local bandits were usually opportunistic and could sometimes be reasoned with or bought off. The tribal raiders, however, were often looking for more than just goods. They sometimes took captives to sell as slaves, and they were typically better armed and more disciplined in their attacks. "Local men, from what I could learn," Ibn Battuta replied, "desperate rather than professional. The winter was harsh this year, and some of the smaller settlements are struggling. Desperate men do desperate things, but they are also more likely to make mistakes. We spent nearly 2 hours in conversation, trading not just information, but also some small goods. I exchanged a bolt of fine wool cloth for a bag of dates that his caravan had brought from an oasis I would not be visiting on this journey. More importantly, we shared details about water sources, the conditions of various wells, and the political situation in the cities and towns along our respective routes. As our caravans prepared to part ways and continue on our opposite journeys, Ibn Battuta pulled me aside for one final word of advice. Hassan, you have always been a careful man, and that is why you have survived so long in this business. But be especially careful in the days ahead. I have a feeling about this season, a sense that the desert is holding its breath before something significant happens. Trust your instincts and do not take unnecessary risks for the sake of profit. His words stayed with me as we resumed our journey, heading deeper into the emptiness that stretched ahead. The desert sun climbed higher, and the familiar rhythm of travel settled over our caravan once again. But now I found myself scanning the horizon more frequently and paying closer attention to the subtle signs that might indicate we were not alone in this vast landscape. The information about bandits was concerning, but it was the kind of practical problem that experience could help solve. Ibn Battuta's more general warning, however, touched something deeper in my merchant's intuition. In this business, survival often depends on recognizing when conditions are different from normal, even when you cannot precisely identify what has changed.
2 days after our encounter with Ibn Battuta, I began to notice the subtle changes that experienced desert travelers learn to read like words written in an ancient language. The wind, which had been steady and predictable, began to shift directions more frequently. The birds that usually flew overhead in regular patterns seemed agitated, changing course suddenly or disappearing altogether for hours at a time. Even the camels seemed more restless than usual, their ears twitching at sounds I could not hear. Zara, my lead camel, displayed the most obvious signs of unease. She had begun to pause occasionally during our march, lifting her head and sniffing the air with a concentration that made me pay attention. Camels have senses far superior to humans when it comes to reading the desert's moods, and I had learned long ago to trust her instincts, even when my own eyes and ears detected nothing unusual. The landscape around us had transformed into the harsh beauty that defines the deep desert. Rolling dunes stretched as far as the eye could see, their surfaces sculpted by wind into patterns that changed constantly, but somehow always looked ancient and permanent. The sand here was a pale gold color that seemed to capture and hold light even in shadow, and walking across it felt like moving through an ocean that had been frozen in time. By our 7th day out from Samarkand, we were completely dependent on the water and food we carried with us. The last reliable well was now 3 days behind us, and the next known water source lay at least 4 days ahead, assuming we maintained our current pace and encountered no significant delays. This was always the most dangerous part of any desert crossing, the stretch where there was no possibility of turning back, and success depended entirely on careful planning
and favorable conditions. Young Farid had adapted better to the desert than I had initially expected. His skin had darkened and toughened under the sun, and he had learned to conserve his energy during the hottest parts of the day. But I could see that the psychological weight of our isolation was beginning to affect him. He had grown quiet, speaking only when necessary, and I often caught him staring out at the endless expanse of sand with an expression that mixed wonder and fear in equal measure. Ahmed, my old friend and fellow experienced trader, shared my growing sense of unease about the conditions around us. During one of our brief rest periods, he approached me with concerns that mirrored my own observations. "The air feels different today," he said quietly, settling down beside me in the shade of his camel. "Heavy somehow, despite the heat. And did you notice how still everything became around midday? Even the wind stopped completely for nearly an hour." I had noticed. In the desert, complete stillness is often a warning sign, like the pause before a wild animal attacks. Nature rarely stops moving entirely unless something significant is about to happen. The question was whether that something would be a weather event, like a sandstorm, or a human threat, like the bandits Ibn Battuta had warned us about. That evening, as we made camp among a cluster of low rocks that provided some protection from the wind, I decided to share my concerns with the entire caravan. Experience had taught me that it was better to prepare everyone for potential difficulties rather than try to shield them from worries that might prove justified. "Tomorrow we will be entering the most remote section of our journey," I announced, as the men gathered around our small cooking fire. "The next few days will test all of us, and I want everyone to be especially alert to changes in our surroundings. If you notice anything unusual, no matter how small it may seem, bring it to my attention immediately." I explained about the behavioral changes I had observed in the animals, the unusual wind patterns, and the unnatural stillness that had marked our day. Some of the younger men looked frightened by this information, but I could see that the more experienced traders nodded in understanding. They had learned to read the desert's moods as well, and they had noticed the same troubling signs. I woke before dawn on our 8th day to find Zara standing alert beside my sleeping area, her head raised and her nostrils flaring as she tested the air. This was unusual behavior for her. Normally, she would remain lying down until I began stirring and preparing for the day's travel. Her obvious agitation immediately put me on edge, and I rose quickly to assess what might be troubling her. The eastern horizon, where the sun should soon appear, looked strange. Instead of the clear line between earth and sky that usually marked dawn in the desert, there was a hazy, reddish band of color that seemed to shimmer and move. The air itself felt different against my skin, charged with an energy that made my hair stand up slightly and gave everything a peculiar electric quality. I had seen signs like this before, though not often, and never in this particular combination. The desert was preparing for something significant,
and based on the atmospheric conditions and the behavior of the animals, I suspected we were facing the approach of a major sandstorm. Such storms could be deadly if a caravan was caught unprepared, but they could also be survived if the right precautions were taken quickly. I immediately began waking the other members of our caravan, starting with Ahmed and the other experienced traders who would understand the urgency of our situation without lengthy explanations. Within minutes, we had everyone awake and began the rapid process of preparing our animals and goods for what was likely to come. "How long do we have?" Ahmed asked, as he helped me secure additional coverings over our most valuable merchandise. I studied the horizon again, noting how the strange reddish haze had grown more pronounced even in the few minutes since I had first noticed it. "Not long," I replied. 2 hours, maybe 3 if we are fortunate. We need to find shelter immediately." The challenge was that we were currently crossing a relatively flat section of desert with few natural formations that could provide protection from a major storm. Our maps indicated that there were some low hills about an hour's travel to the north, but reaching them would mean deviating from our planned route and potentially getting lost if the storm hit while we were traveling. I gathered the caravan leaders for a quick discussion of our options. We could attempt to reach the hills and hope to find adequate shelter among the rocks there. We could try to continue on our planned route and hope to outrun the storm to a small oasis that lay perhaps 6 hours ahead. Or we could stop where we were and try to create our own protection using our animals and supplies. "I vote for the hills," said Ahmed immediately. "Better to face the storm from a position of some strength than to be caught completely in the open." The others agreed, and we immediately began reorganizing our caravan for rapid movement toward the north. This decision would cost us time and potentially put us off course, but it offered our best chance of survival if the approaching storm proved as severe as the sign suggested. As we urged our camels into a faster pace than we normally maintain during the heat of the day, I could feel the wind beginning to pick up. It came in gusts that seemed to have no pattern, sometimes pushing us forward, sometimes hitting us from the side with enough force to make the camels lean against it. The sand began to move differently as well, no longer just shifting gently across the dune faces, but starting to lift into the air in small whirls and spirals. Farid rode up beside me, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and excitement. He said, "I have never seen anything like this. How bad will it be?" I looked at the horizon again and saw that the reddish haze had resolved into a distinct wall of sand and dust that stretched across the entire eastern sky. It was still distant, but it was moving toward us with the steady, inexorable advance of something vast and unstoppable. "Very bad," I told him honestly, "but we have faced bad storms before and survived them. The key is to not panic, to trust in our preparations, and to help each other through whatever comes."
We reached the hills with perhaps an hour to spare, though it felt like we had been racing against time itself. The rocky formations were not ideal shelter, but they were infinitely better than being caught in open desert when the storm hit. We found a narrow canyon between 2 low ridges that would provide some protection from the wind, and we immediately began the process of creating a defensive position against what was coming. The camels, sensing the approaching danger, had become increasingly difficult to manage. Even Zara, normally the calmest and most reliable animal in our caravan, was pulling against her lead rope and making low, distressed sounds deep in her throat. We arranged the animals in a tight circle, with their backs to the direction from which the storm was approaching, and we positioned our supplies and equipment to create additional wind breaks. Each man wrapped himself in multiple layers of cloth, leaving only a small opening for his eyes, and we all checked and double-checked our water supplies to make sure they were securely sealed against the sand that would soon be flying through the air like tiny daggers. I had experienced sandstorms before, but I was struck again by how quickly the familiar desert could transform into an alien and hostile environment. The wall of sand reached us just as we finished our preparations. One moment we were working frantically in the strange reddish twilight that preceded the storm, and the next moment we were engulfed in a world of chaos and noise that seemed to attack us from every direction at once. The wind hit with a force that nearly knocked me off my feet, carrying with it sand so fine and fast-moving that it felt like being pelted with tiny stones. The air became so thick with dust and debris that I could not see my own hand when I held it at arm's length. The sound was overwhelming, a constant roar that made communication impossible except by shouting directly into someone's ear. I huddled against Zara's side, using her bulk as a shield against the worst of the wind, and tried to keep track of the other members of our caravan. In conditions like these, it was easy for someone to become separated from the group and lost in the swirling chaos. I had heard stories of men who wandered just a few feet away from their companions during a storm and were never seen again. The storm seemed to go on forever, though I later calculated that the worst of it lasted perhaps 4 hours. Time becomes meaningless when you are focused entirely on the simple act of survival, when every breath requires conscious effort and every moment brings new challenges. The sand found its way into everything despite our precautions, coating our food, filling our water containers, and working its way through multiple layers of cloth to sting our skin. At some point during the height of the storm, I heard a shout from somewhere nearby, barely audible over the roar of the wind. Someone was in trouble, but the sound seemed to come from every direction at once, and I could not determine where it had originated. I called back, adding my voice to the chaos, and hoped that whoever was in distress would hear me and be able to navigate toward the sound. Young Farid appeared beside me suddenly, emerging from the storm like a ghost. His face was covered with cloth, but I could see the fear in his eyes above the fabric. He pressed his mouth close to my ear and shouted something I could not quite make out. I nodded anyway, hoping to provide some reassurance, and guided him to a position where Zara's body would provide better protection from the flying sand. The worst part of any sandstorm is not the physical discomfort, though that can be severe, but the psychological impact of being completely cut off from the normal world. In the midst of the swirling chaos, it becomes easy to believe that the storm will never end, that you will spend the rest of your life trapped in this howling nightmare of sand and wind. Maintaining hope and sanity in such conditions requires a kind of mental discipline that can only be developed through experience. Eventually, gradually, the fury of the storm began to diminish. The wind, which had been a constant, overwhelming presence, started to come in gusts, separated by brief moments of relative calm. And the wall of sand that had surrounded us began to thin, allowing occasional glimpses of the landscape beyond. And finally, after what felt like an eternity, the last of the storm passed over us and moved on toward the west, leaving us in a world transformed by its passage.
The silence that followed the storm was almost as unsettling as the chaos that had preceded it. After hours of constant, overwhelming noise, the sudden quiet felt unnatural, as if the world itself was holding its breath. I remained pressed against Zara's side for several minutes after the wind had died down, partly because my body was reluctant to believe that the immediate danger had passed, and partly because I needed time to gather the courage to assess what the storm had done to our caravan. When I finally raised my head and looked around, I found myself in a landscape that was both familiar and completely alien. The hills and rocks that had provided our shelter were still there, but everything was covered in a fine layer of sand that had settled into every crevice and depression. Our carefully organized supplies were scattered and buried, some visible only as vague mounds in the new topography that the storm had created. The first priority was to account for every member of our caravan, both human and animal. I began calling out names, and gradually, like figures emerging from graves, the other traders began to appear from behind rocks and camels where they had sheltered during the storm. Ahmed emerged first, shaking sand from his robes and coughing to clear his throat. Then came Farid, looking dazed but unharmed, followed one by the rest of our group. Miraculously, everyone had survived. We had some injuries, mainly cuts and scrapes from flying debris, and everyone was suffering from the effects of breathing sand-filled air for hours. But no one had been seriously hurt or lost. The camels had fared reasonably well too, though they were all coated in sand and clearly exhausted from their ordeal. The damage to our goods and supplies was more serious. Many of our water containers had been compromised by the fine sand that had worked its way through seals and coverings we had thought were secure. Our food supplies were contaminated, and several bales of valuable silk had been damaged by moisture that had somehow combined with the sand to create a gritty paste that stained the delicate fabric. Most concerning of all was the discovery that our navigation instruments had been damaged. The astrolabe I relied on for determining our position had been filled with sand so fine that it jammed the delicate mechanisms. My compass, which had guided me safely across the desert for more than 15 years, now spun wildly and refused to settle on any consistent direction. "How bad is it?" Ahmed asked,
as he joined me in examining the damaged instruments. His voice was hoarse from the storm, and I could see the concern in his eyes as he watched me attempt to clean sand from the astrolabe's intricate workings. "Bad enough," I replied honestly. "Without these instruments, we will have to rely on dead reckoning and the stars to find our way. It can be done, but it will be much more difficult, especially if we encounter more bad weather." The process of digging out and reorganizing our supplies took most of the remaining daylight. Everything had to be inspected, cleaned as much as possible, and repacked. We discovered that we had lost approximately a quarter of our water supply to contamination and leakage, which meant that we would need to reach the next reliable source more quickly than originally planned, or find alternative sources along the way. As evening approached, we faced a crucial decision about our immediate future. We could attempt to return to our original route, which would require traveling across unfamiliar terrain without reliable navigation instruments. We could try to continue northward, hoping to intersect with one of the alternate trade routes that ran parallel to our planned path. Or we could remain where we were for another day, while attempting to repair our navigation tools and reorganize our supplies more thoroughly. I called a meeting of the senior traders to discuss our options. The conversation was subdued, marked by the exhaustion and stress we were all feeling after our ordeal. But it was also focused and practical. These men understood that our survival depended on making the right choice in the next few hours. "I say we stay here tomorrow and try to get our bearings properly," suggested one of the older merchants, a man named Yusuf, who had been quiet during most of our journey, but whose opinion I respected. "Better to lose a day now than to wander lost for a week." Ahmed disagreed. "Our water situation is too precarious for delays. We need to move toward the next source as quickly as possible, even if we have to navigate by guesswork and star sights." In the end, I made the decision that my instincts told me was correct, even though it involved considerable risk. We would leave at dawn and attempt to navigate back to our original route using the traditional methods that merchants had employed for centuries before the invention of precise instruments. The stars would be our guides, along with careful observation of the sun's position and the subtle signs that experienced desert travelers learn to read in the landscape itself.
By our third day after the storm, it had become clear that we were not where I thought we should be. The landmarks I expected to see were not appearing, and the terrain around us did not match the mental maps I had developed over years of traveling this route. We were not completely lost. I could still determine our general direction and had a rough sense of how far we had traveled. But the precision that safe desert travel requires had been compromised by the storm and our damaged navigation tools. The psychological effect of this uncertainty on the caravan was more troubling than the practical difficulties it created. Desert travel depends heavily on confidence and routine, on the feeling that each day's journey brings you measurably closer to your destination. When that certainty is removed, when each sunrise brings the possibility that you are moving further from safety rather than closer to it, the stress can break men's spirits as surely as lack of water can break their bodies. Young Farid was showing the strain most clearly. He had started the journey with the enthusiasm of youth and the conviction that his first major trading expedition would be a grand adventure. The sandstorm had shaken that confidence, and now our navigation difficulties were transforming his excitement into fear. I watched him scanning the horizon constantly, as if he could force the familiar landmarks to appear through sheer will. Ahmed, meanwhile, had become increasingly quiet and withdrawn. This worried me more than Farid's obvious anxiety, because Ahmed's silence usually indicated that he was genuinely concerned about our situation. Ahmed was not given to panic or unnecessary worry, so when he stopped offering his usual commentary on our progress and the conditions around us, I knew that he shared my growing fears about our position. On this particular morning, as we prepared for another day of uncertain travel, I decided to climb to the top of a nearby hill to get a better view of the surrounding landscape. What I saw from that elevated position was both reassuring and troubling. The good news was that I could see what appeared to be an oasis in the distance, perhaps a day's travel to the northwest. The concerning news was that I did not recognize this oasis from any of my previous journeys, which meant that we were definitely off our planned route. I spent nearly an hour on that hilltop, studying the terrain in every direction and trying to reconcile what I was seeing with my knowledge of the region's geography. Eventually, I developed a theory about where we might be. If I was correct, the oasis I could see was not one of the major stops along the established trade routes, but rather a smaller water source used mainly by local nomads and occasionally by merchants who had been blown off course by weather or other difficulties. This realization presented us with both an opportunity and a dilemma. The opportunity was that this oasis would allow us to replenish our water supplies and rest our animals, which had become increasingly important given our current situation. The dilemma was that reaching this unknown oasis would take us even further from our intended path, and I had no reliable information about the routes that led from there back to the main trading corridors. When I returned to the caravan and shared this information with the other traders,
The discussion that followed revealed the depth of concern that everyone was feeling about our situation. Some argued that we should continue trying to find our original route rather than risk becoming more lost by deviating toward an unknown destination. Others felt that our water situation was becoming desperate enough that any reliable source was worth pursuing, regardless of the navigation complications it might create. How certain are you that what you saw is actually an oasis? Asked Ahmed, voicing the question that I knew was in everyone's mind. In conditions like these, it is easy for the eyes to see what the heart wants to see. It was a fair question, and one that went to the heart of desert survival. Mirages were common in this environment, and the combination of heat, stress, and dehydration could make even experienced travelers see things that were not really there. I had been careful to observe the distant green area from multiple angles, and to look for the specific signs that distinguish real vegetation from optical illusions. But absolute certainty was impossible from such a distance. I am as sure as I can be without actually reaching it, I replied. The vegetation appears consistent and stable, not shifting like a mirage would. And the way it sits in the landscape looks right for a genuine water source. After much discussion, we decided to alter our course toward the oasis I had spotted. It was a gamble, but it seemed like the most reasonable response to our current circumstances. We would reach the water source, rest and resupply, and then try to determine our best route back to familiar territory.
The oasis was real, and it was even better than I had hoped. As we crested the final hill before reaching it, the sight that greeted us was like a blessing from heaven itself. Clear, fresh water bubbled up from underground springs and collected in several small pools, surrounded by date palms and other vegetation that provided blessed shade after our days in the open desert. But we were not alone. As we approached the oasis, we could see that it was already occupied by a small group of nomads with their own animals and temporary shelters. This discovery brought both relief and caution. The presence of other people suggested that this was indeed a legitimate water source and not some kind of trap or dangerous location. However, it also meant that we would need to negotiate for permission to share the resource and ensure that our presence would not create conflicts. The nomads proved to be friendly and hospitable, as is the custom among desert peoples who understand that survival often depends on mutual assistance. Their leader, an elderly man named Salim, whose weathered face spoke of decades spent in the harsh environment, welcomed us warmly and invited us to make camp near their own shelters. "You look like men who have seen trouble recently," Salim observed as we settled our animals near the water.
His eyes, sharp despite his apparent age, took in our sand-stained clothing, our damaged equipment, and the exhausted condition of our camels. I explained about the sandstorm and our subsequent navigation difficulties, and Salim nodded with the understanding of someone who had faced similar challenges many times in his own life. The desert has been unrestless this season. We have seen 3 major storms in the past month, which is unusual even for this time of year. More importantly for our immediate situation, Salim was able to provide us with information about our current location and the routes that would take us back to the main trading corridors. As I had suspected, we were significantly off our planned course, but not hopelessly lost. There were several options for returning to familiar territory, though each involved its own risks and challenges. The quickest route back to the main Silk Road would take you northeast for 3 days, Salim explained, drawing a rough map in the sand with a stick. But that path crosses territory that has been troubled by bandits recently. A safer route would take you south and then east, but it would add at least a week to your journey. The decision we faced was essentially about balancing time against safety. Our delayed schedule was already going to cost us money, as some of the goods we carried were expected at specific markets during particular seasons. Every additional day of travel meant reduced profits and potentially missed opportunities. On the other hand, the reports of bandit activity that we had been hearing from multiple sources suggested that the shorter route might involve risks that could cost us far more than time. We spent 2 full days at the oasis, resting our animals, replenishing our water supplies, and learning everything we could from Salim and his people about the current conditions along the various routes available to us. During this time, I was also able to partially repair my navigation instruments using tools and materials that the nomads generously shared with us. The compass remained problematic, but I managed to clean enough sand from the astrolabe to make it functional again, though not as precise as it had been before the storm. Combined with careful star observations and the detailed local knowledge that Salim provided, I felt confident that we could navigate successfully regardless of which route we chose. On our final evening at the oasis, as we sat around a fire sharing stories and enjoying the luxury of abundant fresh water, I made the decision that would determine the rest of our journey. We would take the shorter but more dangerous route, but we would travel with extra caution and make specific preparations for the possibility of encountering bandits. We are traders, not warriors, I explained to the assembled members of our caravan. But we are also not helpless victims. If we are careful and smart, we can minimize the risks while still making good time toward our destination. The next morning,
As we prepared to leave the oasis and the generous nomads who had helped us recover from our ordeal, I felt a mixture of gratitude and apprehension. We had survived the sandstorm and found our way back to a viable path forward. But the most dangerous part of our journey still lay ahead.
3 days after leaving the oasis, we encountered a problem that every desert merchant fears above all others. Our water supplies were running dangerously low, and the next reliable source was still at least 2 days away, according to Salim's directions. What made this crisis particularly troubling was that it should not have happened. Despite our careful calculations and the generous refill we had received at the Nomad Oasis, something was wrong with our consumption rate or our estimates of the distance ahead. I discovered the severity of our situation during the early morning water distribution, a daily ritual that I personally oversaw to ensure fair allocation and careful monitoring of our supplies. As I measured out each man's ration for the day, I realized that our reserves were nearly half of what they should have been at this point in our journey. A quick inspection of our water containers revealed the source of the problem. Several of our leather water bags had developed small leaks, probably from the stress of the sandstorm, and had been slowly draining away our precious supply without anyone noticing. The mathematics of our situation were stark and frightening. At our current rate of consumption, including water for the camels, we had perhaps a day and a half of supply remaining. If Salim's estimates of distance were accurate, we might reach the next water source with barely enough to survive. If his estimates were wrong, or if we encountered any delays or difficulties, we would find ourselves in the most dangerous situation a desert caravan can face. I called Ahmed aside to share this information with him before announcing it to the rest of the caravan. His weathered face grew pale as I explained our circumstances, and I could see him making the same mental calculations that I had already completed. We both understood that this was no longer just about discomfort or inconvenience. This was about survival. Do we have any options for finding water before the next major source? Ahmed asked quietly, his voice betraying the strain he was feeling. I had been considering this question since discovering our predicament. Salim mentioned some smaller water sources along this route, but he was not certain about their current condition. Some of them are seasonal and may be dry. Others might be contaminated or too salty for drinking. The decision I faced was whether to share this information with the entire caravan immediately or to wait and see if we could solve the problem without causing panic among the men. Panic in the desert can be as deadly as thirst, leading people to make poor decisions or to waste precious energy on fear rather than focusing on practical solutions. After much consideration, I decided to tell everyone about our situation. These were experienced traders, not inexperienced travelers, and they deserved to know the truth about the dangers we faced. Moreover, I might need their help in making decisions about how to respond to our crisis. The reaction to my announcement was sobering, but not panicked. These men had chosen to make their living in one of the world's most dangerous professions, and they understood that such risks were part of the price they paid for the potential rewards of successful trading. They listened quietly as I explained our water situation and the options available to us. Young Farid, who had shown such fear during the sandstorm, surprised me with his composure. "What can we do to improve our chances of survival?" he asked, his voice steady despite the obvious concern in his eyes. "We reduce our water consumption to absolute minimums," I replied. "We travel during the coolest parts of the day and rest during the heat. We lighten our loads by abandoning any non-essential goods that are slowing us down. And we pray that Salim's information about the distance ahead was accurate." The next few hours were spent implementing these emergency measures. We selected items from our cargo that could be abandoned without catastrophic financial loss, creating caches that we marked carefully in case we might be able to return for them later. We reorganized our travel schedule to begin before dawn and stop well before the heat of midday became unbearable. And we instituted water discipline so strict that every drop was precious. The psychological effect of these changes was immediate and profound. The relaxed, almost meditative rhythm that had characterized our journey was replaced by a focused intensity that reflected our new reality. Every step forward was now precious. Every hour of travel brought us closer to either salvation or disaster, and everyone understood that there was no margin for error.
By the afternoon of our second day under emergency water rationing, our situation had become desperate. The heat was more oppressive than usual. The camels were showing serious signs of dehydration despite receiving the largest share of our remaining water, and several of the men were beginning to display the early symptoms of heat exhaustion. We had been traveling for nearly 10 hours with only brief rest stops, pushing ourselves and our animals harder than was wise, but knowing that speed was now our only hope of survival. I had climbed to the top of every hill and ridge we passed, scanning the horizon for any sign of the water source that Salim had described to us. According to his directions, we should be very close, but the landscape ahead looked as barren and lifeless as everything we had passed during the previous days. The sun was beginning its descent toward the western horizon, which meant that we had perhaps 4 hours of daylight remaining to find water or face the terrifying prospect of spending another night in the desert with virtually no reserves. It was Ahmed who first spotted what might be our salvation. He had been walking beside his camel rather than riding, partly to save the animal's strength and partly because walking helped him deal with the anxiety that we were all feeling. As we crested a low rise, he suddenly stopped and pointed toward the northeast. "There," he said, his voice hoarse with thirst and excitement. "Do you see it? That dark line on the horizon." I shaded my eyes and looked in the direction he was indicating. At first I saw nothing unusual, just the same endless expanse of sand and rock that had surrounded us for days. But as I continued to stare, I began to make out what Ahmed had noticed, a thin line of darker color that broke the uniformity of the desert landscape. It was so faint and distant that it might have been nothing more than a shadow or an optical illusion, but it was positioned exactly where Salim had told us we would find the oasis. "I see it," I confirmed, though I kept my voice carefully neutral. I had learned to be cautious about distant sightings in the desert,
where heat and desperation could make the eyes see things that the heart desperately wanted to be there. Word of Ahmed's sighting spread quickly through our small caravan, and within minutes everyone was straining their eyes toward the northeast, hoping to confirm what might be our salvation. The effect on morale was immediate and dramatic. Men who had been walking with the slow, measured pace of exhaustion suddenly found new energy. Camels that had been plodding along with their heads down seemed to sense the change in their handlers and quickened their own pace. But I knew that we needed to be careful not to let hope override good judgment. If what we were seeing was indeed an oasis, we needed to approach it systematically and safely. If it turned out to be a mirage or some other type of false hope, we needed to be prepared for the psychological devastation that would follow. I called for a brief rest stop and gathered the senior members of our group to discuss how to proceed. The debate that followed revealed the tension between hope and caution that was affecting all of us. Some argued that we should push forward immediately at maximum speed, reasoning that every minute counted in our current situation. Others felt that we should approach more carefully, conserving our remaining strength in case this apparent oasis turned out to be another disappointment. If it is real water, we will reach it whether we run or walk, Ahmed pointed out. If it is not real, running toward it will only exhaust us unnecessarily. In the end, we compromised by increasing our pace moderately while maintaining enough discipline to preserve our energy for whatever we might encounter ahead. As we drew closer to the dark line on the horizon, it gradually resolved into something that looked increasingly promising. What had appeared as a simple shadow began to show the complex textures and patterns that suggested real vegetation rather than optical illusion. By late afternoon, there could be no doubt that we were approaching a genuine oasis. We could see individual trees, the bright green of healthy vegetation, and most importantly, the unmistakable glint of sunlight reflecting off water. The relief that swept through our caravan was so powerful that several of the men actually began to weep, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming emotion of deliverance from what had seemed like certain disaster. As we made our final approach to the oasis, I found myself thinking about the series of decisions and events that had brought us to this moment. The sandstorm that had seemed like such a catastrophe actually led us to meet Salim, whose directions were now saving our lives. The water crisis that had terrified us for the past 2 days had pushed us to travel faster and more efficiently than we had during the entire rest of our journey.
The oasis that had saved our lives proved to be one of the most beautiful places I had ever encountered in all my years of desert travel. Clear, sweet water flowed from natural springs into several interconnected pools that were surrounded by date palms, tamarisk trees, and patches of grass so green they seemed to glow in the afternoon sunlight. We spent 3 days there, allowing ourselves and our animals to fully recover from our ordeal, while also taking time to properly repair our equipment and reorganize our remaining cargo. On our final morning at the oasis, as we prepared to resume our journey toward Kashgar, I climbed to a high point overlooking our temporary paradise and spent some time reflecting on everything that had happened since we left Samarkand. The sandstorm, our navigation difficulties, the water crisis. Each challenge had tested us in different ways, but we had survived them all and grown stronger as a group. Young Farid, in particular, had been transformed by these experiences, from an eager but inexperienced youth into someone who genuinely understood what desert trading demanded. The route from the oasis to Kashgar was familiar territory for me, a path I had traveled many times over the years. This knowledge brought a sense of confidence and anticipation that had been missing from our journey since the sandstorm had blown us off course. For the first time in weeks, I could predict with reasonable accuracy where we would be each evening, what water sources we would encounter, and how long each day's travel should take. The landscape began to change as we moved closer to Kashgar. The harsh, empty desert gradually gave way to more varied terrain, with occasional patches of scrub vegetation and even some areas where local herders grazed their animals. We began to encounter other travelers as well. Small caravans heading in both directions, individual riders carrying messages or conducting personal business, and nomadic families moving their flocks to seasonal pastures. These encounters were welcome for many reasons beyond the simple pleasure of human company after our isolation in the deep desert. Each meeting brought opportunities to trade information about conditions ahead, to learn about political developments that might affect our business in Kashgar, and to begin the process of reconnecting with the broader network of relationships that made long-distance trading possible. From a merchant named Ibrahim, who was traveling east with a cargo of furs and amber from the northern regions, we learned that the markets in Kashgar were currently experiencing strong demand for silk and spices. This was excellent news for our business prospects, as these were exactly the types of goods that made up the bulk of our surviving cargo. We also heard that the political situation in the region was stable, which meant that we were unlikely to encounter additional complications from local officials or military units. More concerning was Ibrahim's confirmation of the bandit activity that we had been hearing from multiple sources. According to his information, a group of local men had indeed been attacking caravans in the area known as Devil's Gap, and they had become more bold and organized in recent weeks. But he also told us that the authorities in Kashgar were aware of the problem and had increased patrols along the most dangerous sections of the route. They are not professional raiders, he explained during our evening meal together, just desperate men who see wealthy merchants as easy targets for solving their problems. But desperate men can be more dangerous than professionals because they are unpredictable and willing to take greater risks. This information led to long discussions within our group about how to handle the final approach to Kashgar. We could take a longer route that avoided the area where most attacks had occurred, but this would add several days to our journey and take us through territory that was less familiar to me. Alternatively, we could proceed along the main route, but take extra precautions and perhaps time our passage to coincide with the increased security patrols that Ibrahim had mentioned. After much consideration, we decided to continue on the main route, but to travel in coordination with two other small caravans that we had encountered and that were heading toward Kashgar at the same time. There is safety in numbers, and a combined group of nearly 100 men and camels would present a much less attractive target for bandits than any of our individual caravans traveling alone. The psychology of our group had changed significantly during our final days of desert travel. The challenges we had overcome together had created bonds of trust and mutual respect that went beyond the simple business relationships that had existed when we first left Samarkand. We had seen each other at our worst moments and had worked together to solve problems that could have destroyed us all. This shared experience gave us confidence as we prepared to face whatever dangers might await us in the approaches to Kashgar.
The first sight of Kashgar after weeks in the desert was overwhelming in ways that I had forgotten were possible. As we crested the final hill before the city, the view that spread out before us was a feast for senses that had become accustomed to the stark simplicity of sand and sky. The city walls rose from the plain like a promise of safety and civilization, their mud brick construction glowing warm and golden in the morning sunlight. But it was not just the sight of the city that overwhelmed us. It was the sounds that reached us from that distance. The calls of merchants in the markets, the bells and drums that marked the hours of prayer, the voices of children playing in streets we could not yet see. And there were smells carried on the wind that spoke of cooking fires, spices, animals, and most importantly, the green scent of irrigated gardens that surrounded the city like a protective embrace. Our combined caravan had traveled the final days to Kashgar without incident, passing through the area known as Devil's Gap during daylight hours with enough men to discourage any potential attackers. The increased security patrols that Ibrahim had mentioned were indeed visible along the route, and their presence had clearly been effective in reducing bandit activity, at least during the daytime hours when most merchant traffic passed through the region. As we approached the city gates, the complexity of sounds and smells grew more intense with each step. I could distinguish the voices of at least 6 different languages being spoken by people we had not yet even seen. The air carried the sense of cinnamon, cardamom, roasted meat, fresh bread, leather, wool, and dozens of other substances that my nose recognized but could not immediately identify. After the clean emptiness of the desert, this sensory abundance was almost intoxicating. The gates of Kashgar were controlled by officials who were accustomed to dealing with merchant caravans, but the process of entering the city still required patience and diplomacy. Each caravan had to be registered, its goods roughly cataloged for tax purposes, and its members identified to ensure that no one was carrying diseases or contraband that might threaten the city's security or prosperity. The official who processed our caravan was a middle-aged man named Hakim, whose demeanor suggested years of experience with traders from across the known world. His eyes quickly assessed our animals, our remaining cargo, and our physical condition with the practiced gaze of someone who could read stories in the dust on a merchant's robes and the condition of his camels. "You look like men who have seen some hardship recently," Hakim observed as he examined the documents that verified our identities and our right to trade in the city. His comment was not accusatory, merely curious, and I understood that he was simply gathering information that might be relevant to his duties. I briefly explained about the sandstorm and our subsequent difficulties,
and Hakim nodded with understanding. "This has been a season of unusual weather," he agreed. "We have processed several caravans that reported similar problems. The desert has been unrestless this year." The tax assessment on our goods was fair, based on standard rates that I knew from previous visits to Kashgar. More importantly, Hakim was able to provide us with current information about market conditions, the location of caravanserai, where we could stable our animals and store our goods, and the customs and regulations that governed trade in the city. This type of information was invaluable for merchants entering a city after a long absence, as local conditions and rules could change significantly over time. As we finally passed through the gates and entered the streets of Kashgar proper, the sensory assault became even more intense. The marketplace, which began almost immediately inside the city walls, was a chaos of color, sound, and movement that seemed to pulse with its own life. Merchants called out descriptions of their goods in multiple languages. Customers haggled loudly over prices. Animals added their own voices to the din, and underneath it all was the constant sound of thousands of people going about their daily business. The visual spectacle was equally overwhelming. Bolts of silk in colors I had never seen hung from wooden frames that lined the streets. Spices were displayed in carefully arranged pyramids that created rainbow patterns of brown, red, yellow, and orange. Metal workers hammered copper and iron into shapes that caught and reflected the sunlight. Carpets and textiles covered every available surface, their intricate patterns telling stories of the far-off places where they had been created. But perhaps most fascinating of all were the people. In the space of a few minutes, I heard conversations in Chinese, Persian, Arabic, Turkish, and at least 3 languages I could not identify. I saw merchants dressed in the practical traveling clothes of the desert, local craftsmen in the distinctive garb of their trades, officials in robes that indicated their status, and visitors from distant lands whose appearance and clothing spoke of places I had never been. This was why we endured the hardships of desert travel, why we risked sandstorms and bandits and water shortages. This marketplace in Kashgar was where the goods of China met the products of Persia, where the spices of India combined with the furs of the northern forests, and where merchants like myself could transform months of careful travel into profits that would support our families and fund our next adventures.
It is difficult to explain the sensation of entering a great market after weeks in the emptiness of the desert. It's as if the senses themselves have to relearn how to function, how to separate scent from sound, color from motion, taste from memory. For the first few hours, I felt like a man reborn into a world of richness and complexity I had nearly forgotten existed. Everywhere I turned, there was something to draw the eye, the ear, the nose. A basket of dried apricots, dusted with powdered sugar, sat beside piles of roasted nuts and trays of candied ginger that shimmered with crystallized syrup. Nearby, skewers of lamb and onion hissed on open flames, sending up a smoke so fragrant that it made my mouth water even after a full meal. I could smell mint tea being poured, hear the clink of tiny glasses and the low laughter of men catching up on gossip between sips. Children darted between the stalls, barefoot and grinning, their small hands sticky with syrup or fruit. A group of musicians stood beneath a striped awning, playing a tune I half recognized from my childhood, a melody older than any of us, passed down from caravan to caravan, echoing through time like the soft beat of camel hooves on sand. I passed a stall selling silks, so fine they seemed to float in the air, the colors shifting as they moved, deep sapphire, blood orange, pale jade, and a strange violet that seemed impossible under natural light. The merchant, a plump man with sharp eyes and an even sharper tongue, invited me to touch the fabric. I let my fingers glide across it, smooth as water, cool despite the warmth of the day. He watched my expression and smiled knowingly. I didn't need to speak. He could see I knew quality when I felt it. Some stalls smelled entirely of one thing: cumin, turmeric, saffron, sandalwood, while others were a confusion of aromas that hit you all at once. I lingered by a perfume seller whose tiny glass bottles contained scents I could not name. One smelled like the air after rain in the mountains, another like warm bread, and something floral I couldn't place. He let me test a drop on the inside of my wrist. I closed my eyes and felt for a moment like I was somewhere else entirely. But I didn't buy anything yet. No, not on the first pass through the market. That's a rule I learned long ago. Let your senses settle. Let your mind adjust. The first day is for observation, for remembering where the best goods are, for sensing which merchants are desperate and which are clever. The second day is for business. As I wandered, I noticed Farid walking a few paces behind me, wide-eyed and quiet. He was too overwhelmed to speak. I remembered being like that once. The world had felt too big, too alive. I let him soak it in. He used to dream about places like this, he finally said, voice barely above a whisper. But my dreams were quieter. I laughed softly. That's because dreams cannot hold this many smells. He smiled, but his eyes were still wide. Is it always like this? I replied, no. Sometimes it is even louder. By the time the sun began to dip low in the sky, the marketplace was glowing, not just from the lamps being lit, but from the energy that seemed to gather like heat in the stones beneath our feet. I found a quiet corner with a view of the main street and sat down on a crate, letting the scene wash over me. My bones were tired, but my spirit felt strangely light. All the hardship of the desert was behind us now, replaced by the noise and color of human ambition. Tomorrow we would begin the business of trading. But tonight I allowed myself to simply be a man at rest, in a place where the world seemed to gather at once. Spices from India, silks from China, words from Persia, songs from the steppe, and me, Hassan ibn Muhammad, somewhere in the middle, watching it all, breathing it in.
The morning sun had barely lifted above the tiled roofs of Kashgar when I began my rounds through the market. This time, not as a wide-eyed observer, but as a merchant with a purpose. My robes were clean, my mind rested, and the ledger tucked in my satchel bore the careful notes I had made the day before. Prices, locations, the names of traders I recognized, and those I did not trust. The market was different at this hour, quieter, more focused. The laughter and songs of the evening had given way to softer voices, calculations, the shuffling of feet, the clearing of throats before deals were struck. You could smell the seriousness in the air, mingling with the first pots of tea and the faint traces of incense curling from doorways. I began with the silk, knowing it would fetch the best price if I acted early. I approached an old acquaintance, Rafiq, a man with a narrow mustache and hands that moved constantly, as though they were translating his thoughts into air. He greeted me with exaggerated joy. A performance, of course, but I appreciated the effort. "Brother Hassan," he said, placing a hand over his heart, "have the desert winds at last brought you back to my humble little corner of the world?" "They have," I replied, offering a faint smile, "and they've brought silk that would shame the moonlight." He raised an eyebrow, pretending skepticism, but I could see the curiosity already shining in his merchant's eyes. I unrolled a length of deep red silk from my bundle, letting the light catch it just so. He stroked the fabric with a thumb, then frowned in that peculiar way traders do when they're preparing to insult your price while secretly wanting everything you're offering. "What are you asking?" he said. 8 silver coins per yard, and that's the friendship price." He sucked in air through his teeth and shook his head like I'd just offered him a bag of sand. "You wound me, Hassan. I expected better from a man with so much dust in his beard." And so it began, the dance. Back and forth we went, each offer a move in a silent game both of us had played for decades. I lowered my price slightly. He raised his offer grudgingly. We paused for tea midway, as was proper, speaking of our children, the rising price of pepper, and rumors of new roads opening to the south. All of it part of the ritual. In the end, we settled at 6.5 coins per yard, a price I could live with, and one he would still profit from handsomely. This was the way of things. No shouting, no insults, just slow smiles, patient words, and the quiet thrill of 2 skilled men finding the narrow space between loss and greed. I spent the rest of the day moving from stall to stall, trading spices for incense, gemstones for wool, salt for dried fruits. Some deals came easy. Others required the same drawn-out dance, each step familiar, each word weighed. My mind stayed sharp, but never hurried. In the market, time bent around negotiation. There was a satisfaction in it, not just in the gain, but in the practice. The careful balancing of risk and reward, the quiet observation of body language, and the shared understanding that we were all trying to make our way in a world where nothing came easy. By late afternoon, my satchel was lighter, my pockets heavier, and my voice a little hoarse from polite persuasion. I returned to the caravanserai and sat beside Zahra, who blinked slowly at me with her old, patient eyes. "We did well today, old girl," I murmured, patting her neck. "Better than I expected." She let out a low grunt, as if to say she never doubted it. As the sun dipped below the city walls, the market sounds shifted again, from deals and debates to music and laughter. But I didn't return to the stalls that evening. I was tired in the good way, the way that comes when your hands and mind have worked together towards something useful. I leaned back against the stable wall and watched the light fade from the sky. The air smelled faintly of cumin and orange peel. Somewhere nearby, a woman was singing a lullaby in a language I didn't know, and I thought, not for the first time, that no matter how long the road had been, it had all been worth it for days like this.
It was on the second evening in Kashgar, just after the stars had begun to prick the sky, that I ran into someone I never expected to see again. I had wandered back into the marketplace, not to trade this time, but simply to enjoy the feeling of being among people, the warmth of shared presence, the gentle chaos of a city alive. The air was cooler now, threaded with the smell of roasted chestnuts and sweet tobacco. Lanterns swung from wooden beams, casting amber pools of light onto the dusty stones below. Children chased each other between stalls as their parents packed up their goods. A musician sat cross-legged in a corner, coaxing a sad, trembling melody from a bowed instrument I couldn't name. I was admiring a display of carved ivory combs when I heard a voice behind me, low, familiar, with an accent I hadn't heard in years. "Hassan ibn Muhammad, or has time given you another name?" I turned, and for a heartbeat, the world stood still. Standing there, wrapped in a dark wool cloak, was Yusuf, once my closest companion on the road. We had shared a dozen journeys in our younger years, laughing under stars, arguing over prices, mending wounds together after a skirmish outside Aleppo. And then, 10 years ago, he had disappeared. Word was He joined a larger expedition headed deep into China. I had assumed him dead. I stared at him, unsure if I was seeing a ghost or a trick of the lamplight. "Yusuf," I managed, my voice rough. "By the Prophet's beard, is it really you?" He smiled. "In the flesh, a little older, a little richer, and just as tired of boiled millet as I was 10 years ago." We embraced the way old friends do, with a kind of stunned laughter and quiet understanding that no words can fully express. When we finally stepped back, I studied his face. The years had carved new lines into his brow, and his beard had streaks of gray I didn't remember. But his eyes were still sharp, still mischievous. We found a tea house tucked behind the main street, a quiet place with clay cups and cushions low to the ground. As we sat and sipped the strong, spiced brew, we caught each other up on the missing years. He told me stories of trade routes along rivers I had never seen, of markets carved into mountainsides, of sleeping in the open with wolves howling nearby. He had married once, briefly, and lost her to illness in a place so remote even the stars seemed foreign. His eyes dimmed as he spoke of it, and I said nothing, just let the silence sit between us like a third companion. I shared my own stories, though they felt small in comparison. Of floods near Herat, of a caravan leader who turned thief in the night, of a child born in Merv who might carry my eyes. He listened with that same tilted head attentiveness I remembered, as if every word mattered. We spoke until the street outside grew empty and quiet, and the tea grew cold in our cups. Eventually, Yusuf leaned back and smiled. "I thought I might never see you again," he said. "So did I replied. "You staying long?" "2 more days, then I head west." He nodded. "Same. I'm bound for Antioch." We promised to travel the first leg of the journey together, not out of necessity, but for the comfort of old rhythms, old friendships. There are few men on this earth I trust fully, but Yusuf has always been one of them. That night, as I lay in my bedroll beneath the caravanserai's wooden beams, I stared up at the darkened ceiling and let the memory of his voice echo in my mind. The road is full of hardship, yes, but every so often it gives something back. A reunion, a kindness, a second chance. And in that moment, I felt deeply, quietly, grateful to be exactly where I was. The following morning began like any other, with the rustling of packs, the scent of boiled tea leaves, and the quiet murmurs of traders preparing their wares. Yusuf and I met at the edge of the caravanserai, where the camels had been fed and watered, their great eyes blinking lazily in the golden light of early day. We had planned to spend one more full day in Kashgar before setting out, but word reached us before noon that would shift the mood of our little group entirely.
The warning came from a tanner I knew only by sight, a wiry man with rough hands and a sharp tongue, who dealt mostly in leather and gossip. He approached as I was inspecting a shipment of dried apricots and placed a hand lightly on my arm. "You're heading west, aren't you?" he said, voice low, eyes scanning the crowd. I nodded cautiously. "Then mind the passes," he said. "2 nights ago, a caravan never arrived. Gone. No word. People are saying the Devil's Gap isn't as safe as the officials claim." I narrowed my gaze. "Another raid?" He gave the faintest nod. "Not the usual chaos. Too clean. Too fast. They say the sentries didn't even have time to light warning torches." He left before I could press for more. That was often the way with news on the Silk Road. Never official, never certain, but rarely wrong. I gathered Yusuf and the rest of our companions in a shaded courtyard that afternoon. It wasn't the first time we'd faced the threat of bandits, but something in the silence of that missing caravan chilled me more than I let on. "The gap may not be safe," I told them. "Rumors say another group vanished without a trace. If we go that way, we go prepared." There was some murmuring, a few furrowed brows, but no real protest. These men had seen enough of the road to know when caution was not weakness, but wisdom. We reviewed our options. A detour north would add days, perhaps a week, to our travel. The southern route was rockier, harder on the camels, and passed near marshlands known for disease. Devil's Gap, for all its risks, remained the fastest, most familiar path. Yusuf spoke up, voice calm. "We've both passed through the gap before. We know the terrain. We can ride early, travel in tighter formation, post double watches, no fires at night, and we move quiet." I nodded. "And we travel light. No lingering, no bartering on the road." That night, the market felt different. The laughter was still there, the spices still rich in the air, but I noticed more guards stationed near the gates. I saw a group of travelers sharpening weapons by lantern light, and I caught sight of a mother holding her child a little closer as they passed a group of armed men with too many coins and too few smiles. The road teaches you many things. How to read weather from the sky, how to find water in barren land, how to read a man's honesty in his eyes. But one lesson it teaches again and again is this: danger rarely announces itself with a shout. It creeps in with whispers. As I returned to my sleeping quarters and closed the door behind me, I listened to the city settle into night. The same Kashgar I had known for years, full of trade, color, and noise, suddenly felt a little more fragile. Tomorrow, we would leave the safety of its walls behind, and beyond them
The desert waited, as it always did. But this time, it was not just the elements we would contend with. It was men.
We left Kashgar at dawn. There was no ceremony to our departure. Only the soft groaning of camels rising under heavy loads, the quiet clink of gear being fastened, and the hush that falls over seasoned travelers when they know what lies ahead. We moved in silence, our breath rising like smoke in the morning chill, our minds already on the road. The journey westward began easily enough. The land outside the city was generous, with small streams and groves of trees that had not yet forgotten the last rains. But as the days passed, the green faded once more into the familiar beige and rust of desert stone. The quiet returned. Not the peaceful quiet of a home at night, but the watchful kind, stretched tight between the ears, full of listening. We made it through Devil's Gap without incident. No signs of raiders, no footprints in the dust, no wreckage of caravans lost. Just cliffs rising on either side of the trail, silent and looming like sentinels. We did not speak as we passed through. Even Farid, who once filled the air with questions, now rode with eyes forward and hands clenched tight on his reins. By the fourth evening, we reached the oasis. Not as grand as the one before Kashgar, but enough. A pool no larger than a fishing boat, a ring of date palms leaning gently in the dusk. The camels drank first, then the men. Then we began to set camp, not speaking much, just nodding, moving with the practiced stillness that came from knowing how fragile this moment of rest could be. That night, under a sky littered with stars, we built no fire, just lanterns with the wicks turned low, barely enough to see one another's faces. We sat in a circle and ate in silence. Dried figs, flatbread, slivers of salted meat. The kind of meal you forget even as you chew. The kind meant only to keep you walking the next day. Afterward, I lay back on my bedroll, hands behind my head, staring upward. Yusuf lay nearby, his voice a murmur. "You think we'll ever stop?" he asked. I didn't answer right away. The desert breeze moved gently through the palms, and somewhere beyond the pool, a fox barked into the night. "No," I said finally. "Not until we have no more roads left." He gave a soft chuckle. "Or no more feet to walk them." We shared a long silence, the kind that doesn't need filling. By the time we reached the next trading city, a smaller place with low stone buildings and quiet markets, the road behind us felt already like a dream. We sold some of our remaining goods, made arrangements to restock what we could, and began to talk quietly of the next leg, Damascus, Baghdad, maybe Antioch. It always began this way, in low conversations over dates and wine, with fingers tracing imaginary routes on dusty tables. But I knew, even then, that this journey had changed me. I had seen Farid grow from a boy into something closer to a man. I had seen old friends return from the dead. I had watched the desert test us, strip us down, and leave behind only what could endure. And I had felt something strange along the way. Not pride, not relief, but something quieter, a kind of peace. There is no glory in this life, no great triumphs that history will remember, only moments. A good deal struck, a safe campfire, a friend's voice in the dark. But these moments are mine, and they are enough. So if you are still awake, dear listener, or perhaps drifting somewhere between this world and another, know this: the road goes on, always. In dust or snow, in forest or sea, it waits for those who choose to walk it. And I, Hassan ibn Muhammad, will keep walking it for as long as my legs carry me and my heart still yearns for the horizon. Sleep well, fellow travelers. The journey continues. But for now, may your road be quiet and your dreams full of gentle wind.